Testing. Joaquin, if you are able to hear us, could you please turn your video on and give us an audio test?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Joaquin. 1, 2, 3.
Yep, we've got you coming through. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Our members may join us intermittently because they have meetings and hearings, but I'm glad to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining today's discussion on the future of clean water in the post-Sackett world. Clean water should not be a partisan issue. The year after year, the protection of clean water for our families, our communities, and our environment ranks the highest among American families for its public support. That support only increases when access to clean water is threatened, such as through increased pollution, climate change, and recurrent drought. As we all know, we're heading into severe drought. I hope we can agree that our families and future generations should have the same access to clean water, regardless of zip code. Yet we often hear disagreement on how to protect our water or who should pay for keeping the water safe, clean, and healthy. For 50 years, the Clean Water Act has provided the framework for comprehensive and scientifically grounded efforts to protect clean water. The act was Congress's response to a failed state-led, where every state was given the ultimate responsibility for protecting its own water bodies. Didn't happen very well. In essence, the Clean Water Act created a comprehensive national program carried through a strong partnership through and with EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the states. The act ensured each entity had specific complementary role to play in protecting clean water and guaranteed consistent levels of protection for both upstream and downstream states, especially downstream. The success of the act was clear. Rivers no longer catch fire. The streams and wetlands that are so crucial to the health of water bodies have been protected against degradation or destruction. Thanks to the Clean Water Act, waters are cleaner today than we were in 1972, and progress is continuing, although it may not always be as fast as we would like it to be. Yet, in an apparent effort to serve their own conservative theology, 5 members of our Supreme Court decided to ignore the law, to ignore the science, to ignore over 50 years of success in protecting clean water in the Sackett decision. Today, we will discuss its implications of this decision and what it means for the future of clean water. We should all be concerned with the potential impacts of Sackett decision. The ruling likely caused more damage to the protection of clean water than Trump's dirty water rule, a failed effort, and would have removed protection of 50% of our nation's wetlands, 70% of our nation's streams. Some say that the court got it right and that everything will be just fine because states will simply do the right thing and fill the gap. Yet, as the trend of the last few years continues, the battle for clean water may be changing to the state and local level, where polluters will continue to push to remove clean water protections at every chance. Unfortunately, this is not an academic issue, as ever-increasing level of clean water protection comes at a cost to our communities in terms of flooding, decreased water availability, or degraded water quality. A cost to American families who will have to pay more for access to clean water, that is, if water is even available. A cost to our economy and to the farmers, businesses, and industries that lose reliable access to clean water, and a cost to our states and our tribes who now must shoulder a great burden without additional resources. And of course, a cost to our national environment and our clean water issues, the clean water of the future. I would like to now recognize our ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for any remarks.
Well, I want to thank Ranking Member Napolitano for convening the forum today, roundtable to discuss the impact of Sackett. So while we await more exact impact analysis, the initial estimates do predict a broad removal of protections for waters nationwide. I want to thank you for assembling such a varied group and varied perspectives for the panel. The Sackett decision will affect specific regions and communities differently, so it is fitting to bring such a wide range of participants to speak to those impacts. Relying upon estimates from the EPA's Navigable Waters Protection Rule under the previous administration, which similarly negated the significant nexus test, this decision could threaten roughly 50% of wetlands and 70% of rivers and streams, that have been protected since the creation of the Clean Water Act. The impacts of weakened CWA protections are not limited just to permitting rules. For example, we can expect increased flooding when formerly protected wetlands are filled in or polluted. Polluting upstream ephemeral or intermittent streams will likely lead to water body pollution downstream. Pollution could mean beach closures, harmful algae blooms, and habitat destruction to plants and animals that rely on those waters. These kinds of harmful impacts will effectively reverse investments that we've been making for decades. In the BIL, on a bipartisan basis, Congress affirmed its commitment to water infrastructure with a $12.7 billion federal investment for upgrading wastewater systems and preventing pollution. That investment will be moot if these systems are bridled with additional unregulated pollution. Water bodies do not recognize state lines, which is why Congress passed the original Clean Water Act. Having 50 different sets of rules led to downstream pollution from upstream neighbors with different regulations. In Washington State, this is a frequent concern. We need to rely on bordering states' water protections because much of our water flows originate there. Rivers with headwaters in Idaho, as a for instance, come through Washington State, are the same waters that tribes rely on for fishing or that farmers rely on for watering their crops and livestock. House Democrats have consistently supported investments in water infrastructure and clean water protections to support public health, our environment, our communities, and local economies. This decision, if not met with congressional action, could reverse all of those efforts. So I look forward to this discussion today and want to thank you, say thanks to the panelists for your participation in this important roundtable.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. This roundtable was structured to facilitate an open discussion among participants on how we can ensure healthy rivers, streams, wetlands in the post-Sackett world. As such, I would ask each of the participants to make brief remarks, no longer than 2 minutes, maybe we'll go a little more, where you can introduce yourself, your organization, the organization you represent, and provide initial thoughts on how the Sackett decision is likely to impact the health of the nation's waters. Then, I would like to facilitate a real dialogue among all of you on how we as Americans can ensure the progress made over the last 50 years to clean up and protect our rivers, streams, and wetlands, and all the economic and ecological benefits the waters provide. Is not lost because of the court's misreading of the Clean Water Act. I do not plan to hold participants or members to any specific amount of time, but out of respect to other participants, I ask that each member today try to limit the questioning to 1 or 2 questions at the outset. And if we don't get many, maybe you get more. But I'd like to introduce my staff, Ryan Seeger and Morgan Leonard. And with that, I would like to introduce the participants. Joaquin Esquivel, Chair of California State Water Resources Board. He's virtual. Joaquin, where are you?
I'm here. Thank you,
thank
Ranking
you.
Member.
Ms. Betsy Sutherland, former Director, Office of Science and Technology, EPA's Office of Water, thank you. Ms. Keisha Sedlak, Federal Affairs, Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Ms. Donna Downing, Senior Legal Policy Advisor for the National Association of State Wetland Managers, welcome. Mr. Rhett Larson, Senior Fellow, Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University. Ms. Kara Davis, Co-Chair, Healing Our Waters, our Great Lakes Coalition, Tribal Member, Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa Chippewa Indians. Mr. James McElfish, Jr., Senior Advisor, Research and Policy, Environmental Law Institute. Ms. Sherry White Williamson, Director of National Environmental Justice Strategy, North Carolina Conservation Network. And finally, but not least, Mr. Colton Alafungas. Did I pronounce it? Fungus? Fagundes. Sorry. Senior Policy Manager, American Sustainable Business Network. And you're invited. Okay, and Joaquin, you're on.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I just want to thank you and the committee for holding this discussion at a really critical time. Really quick, my name is Joaquin Esquivel. I am Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. We have a 5-member board. We, along with our 9 regional water quality control boards, oversee water quality in the state of California. Additionally, the state board administers water rights And the state board also sets maximum contaminant limits and oversees our nearly 3,000 community water systems in the state. It's really disappointing to have had the Sackett decision at a time here, as you noted, Ranking Member, that we've seen 50 years of progress. And I think for myself and many in our generation, it's really easy to take for granted the quality of life, the ability to go into our streams, our lakes, our rivers, and experience the outdoors in a way that, again, is easy to take for granted. And the Sackett decision ultimately risks that. We're fortunate here in the state of California that Porter Cologne, which actually predates the Clean Water Act and helped inform in part the Clean Water Act, has state authorities that we can rely on. But there will be a resource impact. And I think importantly here, when you look across nationally, the work that needs to be done, we can't be erasing and reversing the progress that we've seen. We know we are already plagued by harmful algal blooms here in our state, let alone nationally. And the threat to our way of life, and especially in a warming climate where these inputs, these protections, and importantly, the function of wetlands in our watersheds is only growing more critical, and need to expand them, both the protections and the wetlands themselves, not retract. And that retraction is something that we're very much concerned about, even again with state authorities that we're able to lean upon. The Sackett decision shrank what are the federal waters. We know state waters, and here in the state of California, are more encompassing. We ensured in 2017 actually that we adopted a new wetlands definition and dredge and fill procedures in case there was a shrinking of the federal circle, if you will. But there is a lot left uncertain still yet. And we look forward to seeing the revised rule come out from the EPA here to interpret the rule, and from there be able to best understand how we can all contribute to the response, which will be very critical. So just thank you for holding this conversation, and I look forward to being able to answer any questions and engage further here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joaquin. The reason we had him speak, he won't be able to be with us the whole time that we have this session going. So I'd like to talk to allow Ms. Betsy Sutherland next.
I'm Betsy Sutherland. I'm the former director of the Office of Science and Technology and the EPA Water Program. I work, oh, it should be on. That it? Okay. I worked for EPA for 33 years in the water and Superfund programs and retired in 2017. I am now a member of the Environmental Protection Network. It's a group of 600 former EPA scientists and regulators who we provide technical assistance on environmental issues to communities throughout the country. The Sackett decision is the most dramatic constriction of environmental law in the history of this country. Congress passed the Clean Water Act in 1972 precisely because the historical reliance on state water quality programs failed to protect the nation's waters and subjected downstream states to unregulated water pollution from upstream states. Sackett has returned over 50% of the wetlands and as much as 70% of the streams to protection only by the states with no federal intervention. For this roundtable, EPN, my Environmental Protection Network, developed a checklist of all the actions the states and tribes will need to take to protect the waters and wetlands excluded from the Clean Water Act by this decision. This checklist makes clear the Supreme Court has handed the states an enormous unfunded mandate. If states and tribes are unwilling or unable to take the necessary actions, small streams and wetlands throughout the country will be destroyed by dredge and fill activities. Pollution will increase from newly unregulated sources, and flooding will worsen in inland and coastal areas. 26 states filed lawsuits opposing the 2023 definition of waters of the U.S., so it is unlikely that any one of these states will be willing to protect Sackett-excluded waters and wetlands. unless Congress amends the Clean Water Act to spell out a detailed definition of waters of the U.S. based on the proven science of hydrologic connectivity, the Clean Water Act's goal of restoring and maintaining the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters will literally be impossible to achieve.
Thank you very much. Ms. Keisha Sedler, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Napolitano, and other members of this subcommittee for the opportunity to share the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's perspective on the fallout of the Sackett decision. My name is Keisha Sedlacek. I am the Federal Director at CBF. CBF is a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 1966 and is dedicated to restoring and protecting the ecological health of the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is our nation's largest estuary and the third largest estuary in the world. Its watershed spans 64,000 square miles and encompasses parts of 6 states: Delaware, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia, as well as the District of Columbia. The watershed has 150 major rivers and streams and contains more than 100,000 small tributaries. There are 1.5 million acres of wetlands, many of which are non-navigable tributaries, non-tidal wetlands, and ephemeral and intermittent streams. Thus, we care about what constitutes a WOTUS. Wetlands provide many benefits, some which have already been mentioned today, including purifying downstream waters by trapping pollutants, protecting low-lying communities, as well as providing essential habitat for migratory birds, fish, and other aquatic species that are central to the Bay's region's outdoor recreation, tourism, and seafood industries. For now, we are fortunate to have most of the states in the watershed having stricter wetlands protections than the federal standard, but not all do. This means that states downstream from those following the federal standard will now have to contend with additional nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment loads, placing a greater burden on the downstream states and impacting the efforts to restore the bay. This is only one of many concerns that I hope we discuss today. I look forward to this conversation, and again, thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sedlec. Ms. Donna Downing, you're on. Thank you.
Thank you. Is the mic on? My first time with the box. Thank you very much for an opportunity to participate in today's roundtable on the implications of the Supreme Court decision in Sackett. I'm Donna Downing, the Senior Legal Policy Advisor at the National Association of Wetland Managers, or NAWM. Prior to coming to NAWM, I was Jurisdiction Team Leader in EPA's Office of Water for 20 years, where, among other things, I oversaw staff efforts to develop an enduring definition of waters of the United States. NAWM is a national professional organization that since 1983 has supported the use of sound science, law, and policy to develop and implement wetland and aquatic resource protection programs. Our members include state and tribal representatives who on a daily basis implement Clean Water Act programs as co-regulators with federal government to protect waters of the United States, or WOTUS. As a result, NAWM has a long-standing and positive working relationship with federal agencies overseeing water resource protection. We also work closely with our members to foster effective state and tribal regulatory and non-regulatory programs to protect wetlands and other aquatic resources, which becomes particularly important when the federal role in water resource protection is changing, such as we're seeing after the decision in Sackett. After Supreme Court decisions in Swank and Rapanos that reduced the scope of waters of the United States, only a small number of states and tribes stepped in to fill the gap in federal aquatic resource protection. This is not due to a lack of concern or interest. States and tribes face very real challenges to fill the gap. For example, the definition of WOTUS and the nature of the gap keeps changing, with 5 different definitions of WOTUS in effect since 2015. Changes in the scope of waters protected by state and tribal laws take time because states and tribes typically have requirements for robust public notice and comment during rulemaking, similar to that at the federal level under the Administrative Procedures Act. Sackett creates additional and huge challenges with its substantial limitations that it places on federal protections of wetlands. Non-members are very concerned about the dearth of federal funding assistance for implementation of wetlands protection programs, noting that unlike other Clean Water Act co-regulator programs, the Act currently does not provide wetlands program implementation funding. I look forward today to the roundtable discussion of Sackett, potential and effective responses to its sharp reduction in the scope of federal protections for the nation's waters. And thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you. Mr. Larson, you're on. Proceed.
Thank you, Ranking Member Napolitano, Ranking Member Larson, and to all the members of the subcommittee and to my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be invited to participate in this important discussion. My name is Rhett Larson. I'm the Richard Morrison Professor of Water Law at Arizona State University. I am also a Senior Research Fellow with the Kyle Center for Water Policy, which is housed at the Morrison Institute for Public Policy at Arizona State University. The Kyle Center is a nonpartisan think tank devoted to improving water policy around the country and around the world, with particular expertise in the arid Southwest. I've spent my entire career working in water policy issues, representing a variety of clients, including in Clean Water Act enforcement and compliance counseling. Americans have every reason to feel proud of the Clean Water Act, which has been a model piece of legislation. But like every legislation, it is not perfect, and like virtually every legislation, over time, its flaws become exposed and it's time to re-examine and reform. One principal flaw that I think has been exposed in the Clean Water Act has been its jurisdictional scope. How can we clarify and improve that jurisdictional scope? And the flaws, I think, evidenced by the fact that we've now spent decades in regulatory reform and in litigation trying to define that. What we've done in the Clean Water Act is take an extremely legally controversial term, navigable waters, which has 2 centuries of litigation around it, and taken that controversial term and defined it with an even more vague term, waters of the United States. This can't possibly be the best way for us to move forward with our flagship piece of water quality legislation. And the challenge is that this is the challenge that exists in all water policy, which is it is the nature of the law to draw lines, and it is the nature of water to defy lines. So the law draws lines. On this side is your jurisdiction, on their side is that jurisdiction. On this side is legal, that side is illegal. On this side, my property, on that side, your property. But water doesn't care about those lines. It will absorb into, flow under, fly over, and erode away any line you attempt to draw around it. And so, 50 years after his passing, I would encourage all of us to embrace the martial arts philosophy of Bruce Lee, who said, be water. If we are to effectively manage water, we have to be more like water and be as adaptive as the resource we are seeking to protect. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. That's very well put. Ms. Kira Davis, you may
Great,
proceed.
thank you. Mado Gazette, good afternoon. I first want to thank you all for inviting me to share my knowledge of the impacts of the recent Supreme Court WOTUS ruling. I come here today wearing a few hats. My name is Kira Davis, and I am a tribal citizen of Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, a federally recognized Great Lakes tribe and signatory of the 1836 Treaty of Washington. I'm also the Great Lakes Program Manager for the National Parks Conservation Association, a nonpartisan organization with over 1.6 million supporters and members protecting and preserving the national park system for future generations. I am one of the 4 co-chairs of the Healing Our Waters Coalition, a coalition of 170+ organizations strong with one purpose: to protect the Great Lakes in perpetuity. This ruling is a complete disregard of the United States federal Indian Trust responsibility to tribes across this nation. This ruling leaves tribes that don't have authority over specific federal regulatory programs without protections to the very waters that tie them to their cultural identity and traditions. This ruling also limits EPA's capability to ensure their trust responsibility under Sections 311, 401, 404, and 402 of the Clean Water Act. We've spent millions of dollars in the Great Lakes region to restore the very waters that the courts leave us unprotected. For example, the National Park Service has spent millions to restore national natural landmarks like Pinhook and Cowles Bog in Indiana Dunes National Park, as well as restoring the Cuyahoga River that we see over there in the poster, which is now swimmable and fishable after 50 years. The Cuyahoga River's drainage area is comprised of 1,700 acres of wetlands and over 190 miles of ephemeral and intermittent streams, waters that may no longer be protected. We must not undo the investment to restore the Great Lakes and other waters across this great nation, as well as leaving tribal cultural resources and relations unprotected. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davis, for that. I agree with you. Mr. McIlfish.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I've come to today's panel with 44 years of experience as an environmental lawyer, first with the federal government, subsequently in private practice, and for 36 years with the Environmental Law Institute, a public policy research and think tank, which is nonpartisan. The Sackett decision stripped federal protection from certain wetlands and waters that had enjoyed that protection since the 1970s. These include many of the nation's freshwater wetlands and headwater streams. And specific concern is intermittent streams, that is, streams that do not continuously flow, that were addressed in dicta in the Rapanos decision, and again in passing, but not in the decision itself in Sackett. I want to focus my brief remarks in two areas. First, in the near term, this decision has serious implications for state clean water programs. Our research at the Environmental Law Institute shows that every state has a definition of waters of the state that includes at least some waters that are not within the definition of waters of the United States. Most states also have generalized prohibitions on polluting the waters of the state. However, fewer than half the states have permitting programs that apply to activities in the waters of the state that no longer have federal protection. And all of the states are faced with some serious decisions. Those states, and we count them as 19, that have fairly robust permitting programs, those 19 states will need to review and revise their procedures and coordination and permit procedures with the Corps of Engineers to ensure that their staff can manage the increased responsibilities they will need to take on. And they will need to revamp their joint permit applications with the Corps and their programmatic general permit agreements. Those states that regulate particular wetlands or particular types of activities in wetlands will need to discern whether or not to expand their existing programs to cover the waters of the state that are no longer covered by their gap-filling programs. And finally, the 1/2 of states that have relied entirely on Clean Water Act Section 401 authority to review and condition or deny Corps 404 permits will need to determine whether to enact new state permitting regimes or to forego prospective review of activities that affect non-WOTUS waters that were formerly but no longer subject to 401 review. The current state of affairs is a patchwork of inconsistent protections across the United States, and in many states this results in gaps in protection. Congress in the near term may want to consider ways to support and encourage state permitting programs that focus on non-WOTUS waters that are important to the hydrologic function or health of traditionally navigable waters or WOTUS waters as a stopgap measure. My second point is that the Sackett decision also will have immediate impacts on numerous federal projects that include impacts both to WOTUS waters, federal waters, and to waters now outside of the Clean Water Act. Federally supported projects such as those under the Water Resources Development Act typically affect both waters that are waters of the U.S. and other waters, and frequently provide for compensatory mitigation for those impacts. Congress could consider including in WRDA amendments requirements that federally funded projects continue to provide compensatory mitigation for impacts to state waters where those state waters have state water quality standards. This would provide a way of ensuring that states still have some of the abilities that they have lost owing to the disappearance of 401. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ms. McElfish. Ms. Sherry White Williamson, please take it.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Ranking Member Napolitano, for the opportunity to speak with you today about the protection of one of our most important natural resources, our wetlands. My name is Sherry White Williamson, and I am the Director of Environmental Justice Strategy for the North Carolina Conservation Network. The organization was launched in 1998 by a collaboration of conservation, environmental justice, and community groups in North Carolina to improve the community's communication and its capacity for effective advocacy. Today, NCCN is a statewide network of over 70 environmental community and environmental justice organizations focused on protecting North Carolina's environment and public health. The organization's vision is that diverse groups engage in environmental policy decision-making at all levels of government, creating a North Carolina committed to improving and protecting the state's vast natural resources. The discussion today is critical to that mission. Hundreds of thousands of identified wetlands across the United States will be harmed if no federal action is taken to assure that wetlands are protected. We cannot rely on state governments to prioritize protection of these important resources. In fact, our state has already taken action that puts North Carolina wetlands in harm's way. A provision of the North Carolina Farm Act of 2023 strips protection for at least half of North Carolina's wetlands. North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper vetoed the bill and issued a statement noting that weakening protections for wetlands would mean more severe flooding for homes, roads, and businesses, and dirtier water for our people, particularly in eastern North Carolina, where I live. Unfortunately, the bill became law late last month after the General Assembly voted to override Governor Cooper's veto. North Carolina Conservation Network and its partners are deeply concerned that reducing wetlands protections will be harmful for communities in our state. We applaud you for taking this step to better understand the implications of not acting at the federal level to protect wetlands, and I look forward to providing further state and community level perspectives on this issue today.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Next, we have Mr. Fagundes.
Hello, thank you. My name is Colton Fagundes with the American Sustainable Business Network, where I'm Policy Director. At ASBN, we work with business leaders along with the investor community across the country. We have a membership of over 250,000 businesses across industries, across every single geography, and in every single state in the nation. At ASBN, we are working currently to elevate the business and economic case for clean water. And through this, we have had many discussions with businesses from our membership and from without our membership, outside of our membership across the country on this issue. So we have found that while a handful of polluters benefit from weakening our nation's clean water rules, most businesses depend on clean water. A few years back, we conducted a poll of businesses throughout our network and found that a majority of small business owners are concerned that water pollution could hurt their business. They favor federal rules to protect upstream headwaters and wetlands, and they believe that clean water protections spur economic growth. So the narrowing of the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, based on the recent decision in the Supreme Court, poses a threat to businesses and local economies throughout the country through increased pollution and the threat of increased flooding. So while almost all businesses depend on clean water at least somewhat, there are a few industries that certainly stand to be most at risk with a weakened Clean Water Act. For example, beverage manufacturing, breweries, almost 90% of the final product of beer is water, and just small changes in the quality of that water can affect the taste and other aspects of the product. Seafood industry, the outdoor recreation industry, specifically recreational fishing and boating providers, Waterside amenities such as hotels and restaurants and on lakes and along the coasts that are at risk of harmful algae blooms. We work with farmers and ranchers that are concerned about the pollution of water sources that they use for their crops and their livestock. Research has shown that home values drop when water bodies they are next to become polluted. And there is the rapidly growing ecological restoration industry that depends on scientific clean water protections to drive demand for their services. Moving forward, we at ASBN, along with business leaders and investors across the country, stand ready to find solutions. Some of our investor members are already taking measures to ensure that their portfolios are supporting businesses that are acting responsible in regards to the Clean Water Act and will continue to do so. They have been doing this in the past, but they recognize the increased importance of this in the post-Sackett versus the EPA world. We also are working with our investors and business members to advance innovative solutions such as green stormwater infrastructure, ecological restoration, and other nature-based solutions. But we recognize the importance of policy and recognize the importance of addressing these holes in our clean water protections. So we look forward to working with experts and decision makers such as yourself to find policy solutions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. I think business can play a bigger role if they try. We need them. I'll start off the questioning with Mr. Esquivel, because you got to go. I'm glad to see somebody from California. We have been a leader in environmental issues, knowing the full value of water resources. However, in the post-Sackett world, that might not be enough, because the states upstream of California might not play by the same rules and would hurt California. Can you comment the ways that California water quality and supply would be threatened by our neighboring states and upstream communities?
Thank you, Ranking Member. While California is fortunate that many of our rivers, lakes, streams are within our borders, they're not interstate, we are incredibly dependent, as we all know, in Southern California on the Colorado River. There's been such a supply discussion around the Colorado, but really it's the quality as well that can limit our ability to both recycle water and have economic consequences when it comes to treating the water along the system. And importantly, it's about, as I understand, for every 100 milligrams per liter of increased total dissolved solids in Colorado River water delivered to Southern California, it's about $300 million in economic impact to the ability to reuse that water, the cost of treatment. And so I'm fortunate that I sit on the Western States Water Council and the Salinity Forum. So we have venues to certainly continue to work with our sister states to ensure that water quality is protected, but without the umbrella of these federal protections, the uniformity of it, and the uncertainty that it's creating, I know amongst a number of projects out there that are left in a bit of a lurch, not knowing under which permits to be able to be covered. We are concerned of these impacts.
Thank you. I know that there are high costs associated with assessing or cleaning up the water resources. To anyone, what are some of the potential economic impact of Sackett on American families in terms of increased costs for drinking water, high prices of food and services, increased residential flood risk, decreased property values, or decreased availability of recreation opportunities? Anybody? Sorry.
I want to demonstrate the impact in Eastern North Carolina with a couple of illustrations, if you'll put those up for me, Sarah. That first picture that you're looking at is Eastern North Carolina. Those red dots are hog farms, CAFOs, in Eastern North Carolina, the majority of which are in floodplains, close to bodies of water. The second photo just below that, if you'll put that one up, Sarah. The red circles are hog farms, and as you can see, there are many bodies of water that are very closely located to those operations, and we're seeing that without the wetlands that serve as a buffer now, there will be many more situations where well water will be contaminated as a result of the runoff from these operations. There are approximately 9,000 hogs in the state of North Carolina. The majority of them are in the southeastern part of the state, And the Cape Fear River is one of the largest river basins in the state, and many of these end up in the Cape Fear River as the larger body of water, which then ends up in the Atlantic Ocean. There is also an issue with PFAS for us there. So the wetlands we will lose the ability as a buffer for that part of the state if there isn't something done at the federal level to protect the communities who are most impacted. And many of these communities are communities that are on well water. They do not have local, county, or city water systems, so many of them are already suffering the consequences of 500-year floods. We've had 2 500-year storms, one in 2016, one in 2018, and had it not been for the wetlands there, it would have been much more destruction in those areas, homes destroyed, businesses destroyed, and those kinds of things. So economically, it's a huge impact for North Carolina, and the Farm Act that was just passed this year strips protections from about 2.5 million acres of wetlands.
Thank you, ma'am. Anybody else? Ma'am? Ms. Betsy Sutherland.
I'd like to add, there was a really excellent study done on the Hurricane Sandy damages, and they have calculated $625 million was saved by wetlands, protecting public property and private property through that hurricane. So we've got quantified estimates that it's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's in addition to New York City, which has shown that they depend on the source water protection from small streams and wetlands above the city to save hundreds of millions of dollars of purifying the drinking water for New York City.
Thank you. Anybody else? Mr. Colton.
Yes, thank you for bringing up that the wetland study. I was going to mention that as well. We work with a sustainable real estate development company in New Jersey that is very concerned. They've taken measures to actually improve and ensure and maintain the hydrological functioning on the properties that they're developing. But they understand that the threat that loss of wetlands could pose, because they're downstream at the mouth of the Hudson River there in New Jersey and Kearney Point. So that's definitely one threat that we could see to economies. And you mentioned property values as well. I think I mentioned that briefly in my statement, but there's research out there that is in a few different states that is, I know one showed a connection between an $80,000 drop in property values on home values when water pollution increased. And that study was done several years ago. I would imagine that number is higher now because of increased property values. And on the reverse, when homes are next to water bodies with high quality water for access for recreation and so forth, home values actually go up.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Downing.
Thank you. I thought I would note EPA's 2015 study on the drinking water implications of Rapanos and the definition of waters of the U.S. You have one of the summary posters here that show the studies in graphic form. The study found that 117 million Americans, about a third of the population, get their water from public water supplies that rely at least in part on intermittent and ephemeral waters for their source waters. And those are the waters that had uncertain protections after Rapanos and likely have less protection after Sackett. It's also interesting to note that the Safe Drinking Water Act relies on the Clean Water Act as the principal protection for source waters for drinking water systems. And the majority of source water protection provisions under the Safe Drinking Water Act are voluntary in nature. Again, shifting focus back to the protections coming from the Clean Water Act.
Thank you. Anybody else? Seeing none, I think we'll open it to members. Mr. Larson.
I have to go, apologize. So I'll ask 2 people this question, and then rather than have everyone answer it. And then as you're answering, I will leave, and you won't notice me at all. You won't notice me leave. There'll be great people here to hear it. It's the polluter pays question, and so I wonder if any of you thought through how the Sackett decision has undermined the concept of polluter pays, and wondering if since your last name's Larson, although it's Swedish, you should apologize to me for that, Norwegian. But if you've looked at thought through how Sackett has undermined polluter pay, and I thought if Tribal Member Davis had some ideas, maybe if how polluter pay has been undermined by Sackett as well. I think it's a question we need to think through a little bit here, because if in fact it has, then this isn't the end of Sackett and its impacts. You start here and then go there. Thanks.
Well, presumably there are going to be a lot of wetlands and many ephemeral streams that are now excluded from Clean Water Act jurisdiction. By extension, that will mean that there are formerly people who would have absorbed some of the compliance costs and then potential enforcement costs associated with the Clean Water Act that now won't be facing those same costs. So in that sense, yes, there's a risk to sort of eroding away the principle of polluter pays. On the other hand, every environmental statute has a circumscribed jurisdictional scope. Every environmental statute ends at some point and doesn't regulate everything. And what Sackett did is draw a line and say the Clean Water Act goes this far and no further, which is certainly true of the Safe Drinking Water Act or the Clean Air Act or any other statute. So the fact that it has a circumscribed scope in general, I don't think means that we're eroding away the polluter pays principle at its source, mainly because every environmental statute has some line drawn that says these people don't have to pay, but these people do.
Anybody else?
I would just say that I agree with Mr. Larson here, this Mr. Larson. And I would also beg you all to think about the jurisdictional points he brings up about water and how it doesn't know lines. You know, our Indian country and tribal communities will no longer have these places that they're connected to protected. And so, yeah, that does worry me a little bit about the polluter pay. But I would agree with Mr. Larson to think about those things that he just mentioned.
Ms. Downing?
I think it's also helpful, it's not sort of another focus of the polluter pays, which is the effect of, for example, filling wetlands and thus reducing the ability to lessen the frequency and severity of flooding. It may be people who, for example, own the land upstream who fill those wetlands or otherwise impair their ability to function as sponges, and the people downstream who may feel the effects. And certainly we've been seeing a lot of unanticipated flooding events in this year and probably in future years. And the reduced protections from Sackett of wetlands, I think, is likely to increase the number of times we see that trade-off where someone fills wetlands and someone downstream feels the effects.
I would add that under the pre-Sackett system, there's a great deal of compensatory mitigation, which is a cost which is imposed if you fill the water of the United States. The compensatory mitigation will presumably no longer occur in those waters that have lost federal protection unless the states themselves have compensatory mitigation requirements. This is a market that we identified some years ago as several $1 billion per year in restoration that was occurring by virtue of Clean Water Act.
But no many states have that, do they? Not many states require.
Many of the states require it through 401, which would no longer apply if you don't need a 404 permit, or if some of the waters are not covered by the 404 permit. Most of the 19 states with fairly robust programs like California, like Virginia, like Massachusetts, do have their own compensatory mitigation requirements. Most do not.
Thank you. Ms. Brownlee, your question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here. I guess my question is really in terms of if anybody is really sort of measuring what the impacts are. I mean, we've had the Trump decision and the rulemaking under that, so we're into it for a couple of years now, and if we have any idea of kind of what the status is and impacts. Yes.
Let me start with that, and I'm sure everybody has their own anecdotes. But we know that when the Trump rule became effective, hundreds and hundreds of requests for jurisdictional determinations came pouring in, and the vast majority were considered to be not waters of the U.S., which means that all of that dredge and fill activity was done without any permit at all, without any mitigation for the loss of wetlands and streams. And I can tell you, I go to West Virginia every weekend. Mountaintop mining is still going on. It's considered to be safer to take the whole top of the mountain off and dump it in the nearby stream bed because you don't have guys going down in elevators and subjecting themselves to black lung. So this is going to be a serious loss of enormous proportions. And the wetlands that were excluded by Sackett far exceed what was excluded by the Trump rule. The Trump rule actually said if you had surface water connection through a man-made or natural barrier, it was still covered. Sackett said no. Any barrier at all, even with a surface connection, all our beach dunes, all our natural berms, all of those wetlands now, every wetland behind the Mississippi levees is no longer included as waters of the U.S.
And do we see impacts on that? And just in terms of, I'm from California, so I'm very familiar with what coastal wetlands look like. I'm not that familiar with what happens in the Midwest, but do you see obvious?
So enormous impacts on the beach when those dunes are blocking now waters of the U.S.
No question.
Storm surges are going to be huge impact. We will not be able to fight those if a land developer decides he's going to fill those the wetlands behind those dunes.
Yep.
All the levees are very important, not just for mediating extremes of flow. They help during drought as well as help during flood times, but also filtering pollutants, all the nutrients and pathogens and other toxics that can come in. All of that is lost.
Very good. Yes.
So I just want to bring attention to a study that the Maryland Department of Environment did. It was analysis they conducted during the comment period for the Trump rule, limiting the definition of wetlands to those with a direct surface connection to navigable waterways. So they looked at two different watersheds to try and quantify what the impacts would be. One is the Nanticoke River in Delaware, and that they found would have up to 36% of the wetlands providing flood attenuation and nutrient transformation functions would now be unprotected. The other place they looked was Pennsylvania to the Susquehanna River watershed, where they found that up to 2.3 million pounds of nitrogen per year would flow down to the bay, as well as 57,000 pounds of phosphorus. And they estimated that the taxpayer in Maryland would have to offset the cost clearly over 20 years, and it would be about $1 billion for them to do so. So clearly there's a huge economic issue going on too, and barrier.
Very good. Yes, ma'am.
Betsy talked about the jurisdictional implications of dune barriers and other things for jurisdiction over the wetlands behind. Under Sackett, levees, natural or man-made, sever jurisdiction as long as the levee is built in accordance with law. It wasn't, illegally built. That includes the natural levees that the hydrology of rivers create and change every time they have high water. And the wetlands behind, for example, those natural levees on the Mississippi would not be jurisdictional when the levee's there, but if there's flooding and the levee moves, it would change what's jurisdictional. Of course, if it's been filled or otherwise demolished in the meantime, it wouldn't have needed a permit. So I think that's an area that shows the breadth of the potential implications of Sackett. As to quantifying the implications, I think there's a key question. Is the Sackett relatively permanent standard the same as that established by Justice Scalia's plurality standard in the Rapanos decision in 2006? Sackett quotes Justice Scalia's opinion, big, block quote chunks, suggesting it is the same standard as Justice Scalia and his brethren created under Rapanos. If that's the same, then the federal government, states, tribes, general public have 17 years' experience implementing the relatively permanent standard. Guidance, tools, and other things that could help us not only estimate the implications of Sackett with greater specificity, but implement the decision in a way that shows it, although Sackett is a huge hit in terms of water resource protections, it doesn't put the feds out of the business. It doesn't put states or tribes out of the business. It constricts it, takes away the significant nexus basis for finding jurisdiction. But for 17 years, the relatively permanent standard was part of the jurisdictional toolbox. It would be really helpful if EPA, the Army Corps, Department of Justice would say, is it the same relatively permanent standard or is there a difference? I personally think because of the block quotes of Justice Scalia's opinion that it's the same, but we need to hear that in order for states and tribes, general public, be able to estimate impacts and begin to fill the gap, just to know what's going on.
Thank you, Ms. Boundy.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And we have Ms. Stansberry, Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. Bayer, Mr. Dunkel. Ms. Stansberry.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Melanie Stansberry, and I'm proud to represent New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, and proud to be a fellow water nerd who's worked on water issues for 20 years of my career and has admired the amazing work of our chairwoman, ranking member, and her leadership for decades on this issue. And I want to thank you all for being with us here today. And, you know, it's hard to believe that we have to say this in the year 2023, but clean water and science matter. And it's hard to believe that we would have to say that in the halls of Congress to a U.S. Supreme Court that undermined decades not only of settled law, but wrote a decision that defies the basic logic of hydrology. In fact, when I read the decision, within a few sentences, it was obvious that literally it didn't make sense. Right? Because anyone who's ever studied hydrology, anybody who's ever worked on water issues, understands that our hydrologic systems are inextricably linked. Surface water and groundwater, wetlands and surface flows, they are linked. And in places like New Mexico, where we are an arid state, if you do not regulate wetlands, then you're not actually protecting surface waters, because they are completely connected hydrologically. Now, I think it's important for the American people to understand that, like so many of the decisions that have come out of this particular Supreme Court, this wasn't about science. This wasn't about clarifying regulatory authority, because if it was, then they would actually come up with a definition that clarified something rather than made it muddier than it already was. And it wasn't about creating certainty for our businesses, regulators, states, tribes, local entities, because in fact it created greater uncertainty, and now we have multiple definitions under which we're going to have to try to regulate clean water. But I do want to just take a moment to talk about why the Clean Water Act exists, and then I want to ask a couple of lightning round questions for all of you, and thank you for being here today. So, you know, I think it's important for folks to know that when the Clean Water Act passed here in Congress a little over 50 years ago, it was a bipartisan bill. And in fact, when it went to the president's desk, and there was a veto threat on the Clean Water Act, it was the Republicans here in Congress that made sure that there would be an override of that veto so that we could protect water for the American people. A lot of people don't realize that. It was completely bipartisan in the 1960s, because what was going on in the 1960s is there were rivers on fire. There was raw sewage being dumped into our streams, our arroyos, into our rivers. There were toxic chemicals being dumped by industrial plants into our rivers without any consideration for the impacts to our communities. There were giant fish kills, and wetlands were being filled in across the country, having devastating impacts for the ecosystems that we didn't realize at the time were completely connected to our own health as humans. And so that is why the Clean Water Act was created. Congress's intent was clear. Their intent was to make sure that we had clean water, right? And so it defies logic that the United States Supreme Court in 2023 could have read that statute in any other possible way, especially after decades and decades of judicial review and clarification. Now, of course, this has a long history politically with the judiciary, going back to, of course, the Rapanos decision efforts by the past 3 administrations to clarify what we mean by waters of the U.S., the efforts by the former administration under Trump to gut the Clean Water Act, the culture wars that have been waged out across America against the Clean Water Act, and the grand finale, of course, the Supreme Court now gutting it. But I think that one of the things that's really important for folks to understand is what this actually means, what the implications are. New Mexico is one of 3 states in the United States that does not have primacy under the Clean Water Act. We do not have a robust water quality permitting program. That means that now, in my home state, it is potential that over 90% of our waterways no longer have protection from sewage, from toxic waste, from farm waste. And in communities, in states, as Ms. White-Williamson's pointed out, that have now gutted their own water protection programs, the vulnerabilities are not just in states that don't have those programs, but in states where the states have actually gutted those programs. And so my first question is actually to you, Ms. White-Williamson, because you did share that. Help us understand, you shared the North Carolina experience. This is not unlike other issues that the Supreme Court has recently handed down decisions on. What happens when the Supreme Court now undermines federal regulatory authority for states like yours, where now communities are not going to have protection because the state is not providing it?
Obviously, a decision like this is devastating for the communities that we work in, because a lot of the places where the protection should be and where wetlands are where impacted communities, Black, brown, and indigenous communities live. And when the floods come, and even when not even floods, heavy rains, because we are in floodplains in many places, they're displaced. And there are more problems, there are more economic issues facing them because they're the least likely to be able to come back from those kinds of situations. So obviously, North Carolina is not the only place that's happening. It will happen all over the United States, but we do have concerns that if this isn't addressed at the federal level, that we don't have any other place to go. I did not mention North Carolina does not regulate poultry. I think Ms. Sedacek, I believe it was, mentioned poultry. And there is a fear, obviously, that builders will be building and taking care of themselves and not thinking about the impact on homeowners. Those facilities end up in the same places where the swine farms are. So you have a double and triple impact in many cases because of what's happening. And if they start building in the wetlands, which we anticipate will happen, then the devastation is just unimaginable.
Right. And, I really appreciate that. And I think that, for a lot of folks who grow up in low-income communities, especially in rural communities, those are communities that have oftentimes been pushed to areas that are already in some way sort of geographically marginal, right? And so now the vulnerability of being, say, in a floodplain or an area that's prone to runoff, all of those things now are amplified by the failure to have some sort of protection at that state and federal level. And so I really appreciate that. And Ms. Davis, I wanted to turn to you. New Mexico is home to 23 sovereign tribes, and New Mexico is actually, our pueblos and our tribal nations have really been at the forefront in seeking primacy and creating their own water quality standards and setting standards that are actually higher than the federal and state standards, in part because water is not only important to drink and for all the purposes that we use it, but because water is life and water is sacred and part of ceremonies and other things. Obviously, for those tribes who do not have Clean Water Act jurisdiction or have chosen not to for various reasons, we know this is going to have really significant impacts. And I wonder if you could speak to that, as well as the importance for tribal nations to establish their own water quality standards.
Sure. Thank you so much, Melanie, for bringing this up. First, I want to mention that I'm from the Great Lakes, so I'll talk mostly primarily about Region 5, EPA, those tribes within EPA Region 5. First, I want to let you know that, as I mentioned, we're connected to the water. We believe that we come from the water, and we'll go back there when we're done here with our responsibilities. I will tell you, 3 out of the 4 of our sacred medicines come from wetlands, and so we have always thought of wetlands as life givers, along with the ephemeral and intermittent streams. In fact, that's where a lot of times we have ceremonies. I'm not sure if people know, but a lot of different states don't recognize the uses of tribes as the way that they use water. Our creation story goes back to a special grain, wild rice, monomen. It's why we survived in the Great Lakes, and we did not have to move. Those wetlands will no longer be protected. That's what gave us life. But I will tell you that tribal water quality standards is not that easy. I'm not speaking on behalf of any tribes here, but I will tell you that it's complex and it's hard. You have moving elections and councils, and you have other problems within Indian country that take precedent. We know that we're going to take care of our waters, but now that we don't have the federal authority, we may not have any protections at all. And it's just because there are other things going on like health, trauma, land fights still and litigation, trying to get our homelands back. So it takes time. And I will just also mention that, at least in the Great Lakes region, there are tribes out there that have some of the most robust, comprehensive water quality monitoring programs I've seen, because they're in smaller geographic areas, and they have different uses. State of Michigan does not recognize wild rice harvesting or areas, as well as ceremonial uses. So sometimes tribes in the Great Lakes will put those in. But yeah, it takes a lot of time. And sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes if you only have to permit a couple different things within Indian country, you would go to your trusted responsibility party, which would be EPA. But now that no longer exists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davis, and Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member. I'm going to keep calling you Chairwoman. I just want to follow on Ms. Davis's comments and also Ms. White-Williams, because I think it's really important that folks understand the real implications on the ground for communities. You know, it's very easy when talking about legal matters and science matters around water to get very esoteric and in the weeds. And I think for a lot of people, they don't even know what we're talking about, right? But when you tell people that this Supreme Court decision just gutted the ability to make sure that you and your children have access to clean water, people are shocked. They truly are shocked. And it's actually probably the second most common thing I get asked about out and about when I'm out in my communities, because it has such significant implications for our communities. And, you know, whether it's communities across the country that are now increasingly vulnerable for any number of reasons to pollution and to other impacts of losing those protections, whether it's our tribal communities who rely on EPA or are also working on their own water quality standards, or it's our ecosystems. This Supreme Court decision is truly a devastating blow to our communities. And Madam Chairwoman, I look forward to working with all of our members to statutorily fix the waters of the United States and to ensure that we're protecting our waters for generations to come. I yield back.
Thank you very much, and we are with you. Next would be Mr. Tanko.
Okay, we're on. Welcome, everybody, and thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you and Representative Larson for hosting this important discussion, and thank you to all of our participants. This week, I was proud to reintroduce my Bipartisan Scientific Integrity Act. Thank you, Betsy. You were very helpful when we first developed this whole concept. But It's legislation that I've advanced for years now to ensure that scientific integrity standards are upheld across all of our federal agencies, wherever there are federal tax dollars invested, and to make certain that that policy is there as a standard, no matter who is sitting in the White House. As one of the few engineers in Congress, I am one who really thinks it's critical to look to science to guide us in our public policy development, and certainly in making decisions to address and solve pressing challenges that our communities face, including abundant, pristine supplies of water. Certainly the court decision, the Supreme Court decision with Sackett versus EPA is a distressing outcome, and it's guided by the conservative ideology, I believe, of the makeup of this court, a very partisan court, oftentimes referred to politicians or justices sitting in political robes that really are not making the kind of decisions that are based on science and evidence-based opportunities. So with that in mind, Bessie, we'll go to you. Ms. Sutherland, can you talk about the science that went into the Biden administration's approach to protecting our nation's water resources, which I think is critically important? This whole decision is assigning us a lot more responsibility, and demanding work and response from Congress is the outcome.
So let me just say that in the 2015 rule, the Office of Research and Development at EPA did a comprehensive view of the world's literature on hydrologic connectivity and all the functions that connectivity provides, not only for the ecology, but for humans and for businesses and for all aspects of life, both health and welfare. That was then updated by the Biden administration for the 2023 rule. So we now have, I would say it's the definitive compilation of the world's literature on the hydrologic connectivity and all the functions and benefits that that connectivity provides to humans and to businesses and to health and welfare. So there's nothing more that could be done. All of that was peer-reviewed by the Science Advisory Board. So we have the top scientists that are available to EPA have said that this compendium is the gold standard of what the science is behind the waters of the U.S. The Trump rule did not use that report at all, and obviously the Supreme Court decision did not look at that science at all. There's no possible way they could have written that decision if they'd even looked at the executive summary of that compendium.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel have any input that they'd like to share in regard to scientific integrity and water policy and the Sackett decision? If not, I will say that it's important for us to see water policy as one that connects very directly to public health and to economic recovery and economic strength. So I just regret I didn't have my water is sexy button today, which I've been given at different forums. But with the scientific integrity issue at EPA, how has that helped to make certain that we protect the voices of scientists, the work of scientists at the agency as it relates to sound water supplies and water quality?
So I think, first, EPA has always had a scientific integrity policy. They're one of the few agencies that had one, but it has really been ramped up since the Biden administration had, at the White House level, new framework for scientific integrity. So I really think that right now there is no suppression of scientific opinion within EPA. All the reports I have from my colleagues in the water office is that it is very collaborative. Everyone gets to speak their mind. And they have really done, with the 2023 rule, what I thought, and I would have given my retirement fund prior to Sackett, that they had gotten it right, that they were right down the reasonable range of including waters that really had a significant contribution to traditional navigable waters in the territorial seas, and that they had not done it or underdone it. I thought we were at the perfect place. And to have lost with this decision, which was so unreasonable and so unscientific, it is a huge loss for this country, and it's going to take years. I don't know how long it will take you to amend the Clean Water Act, but for every day that you're not amending it and getting this fixed, we're going to lose permanently small streams and wetlands in every part of this country. So it's a massive loss for everyone.
Yeah, I'm glad you went into it because that was going to be my next question, and you kind of responded to it. But it does put at risk all of the sound policy that's been developed by the EPA with a lot of science and evidence-based outcomes. And so this is just going against the grain of where we ought to be with scientific development and policy that will protect our resources and allow us to be stronger stewards of our environment. So with that, I thank you all for your activism on behalf of our planet and our environment.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Yes, Ms. Dingle, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for all of you for joining this roundtable. For 50 years, the Clean Water Act has served as an essential pollution prevention tool and has helped us clean up our nation's streams, rivers, lakes, and wetlands. Clean water is a human right, and it's our shared responsibility to ensure we protect human health and our environment for future generations. Whether you live in the heartland near the Great Lakes or out west near the Colorado River, we all benefit from the federal protections of our waters. As one of the architects of the Clean Water Act, John Dingell wrote and made clear, the intent was to protect, quote, all waters of the United States. The Sackett versus EPA ruling by the Supreme Court is deeply, and by the way, John Dingell knew what he was doing. He knew the importance of legislative language. A lot of people don't understand that intent now. He did know what he was doing, as you all know. The Sackett versus EPA ruling by the Supreme Court is deeply troubling, takes us in the wrong direction, and now there's great concern, as you all are talking about today, about what it's going to mean for the future. So I'm really grateful that you're here having this discussion and we're raising the issue so people understand it. So let me just build on what all my colleagues have been doing. Ms. Davis, could you describe what you see the impacts from the Supreme Court's Sackett decision will have on the Great Lake tribes?
Yes, absolutely. And I might throw in national parks too, if that's
You can
all
do
right.
that. That's fine. I'm a Great Lakes girl, so I go that way. But
Well, first I just will mention that, in the Great Lakes region, really our rivers, our waters is what brings people to our region. National parks in the Great Lakes, I'll start with that, brings in $754 million annually to our region. And so just imagine if those ephemeral and intermittent wetland streams that protect the Great Lakes are harmed and unprotected. That we are dependent on ecotourism. As far as tribes are concerned, this is, again, I will tell you, I feel it is a complete disregard for the United States Federal Indian Trust responsibility. And so I mentioned earlier that we are directly connected. There are reasons why people or tribes don't have standards because it's complex and challenging, although some do. I'd like to bring up that there's been discussions, at least within Region 5, EPA Region 5, of thinking about waters of the tribe. There are different uses and perspectives that tribes have about water. We're connected to it. It's part of us. In fact, it's part of all of you. We're 90% water, right? And so, I would also just recommend, too, to maybe think outside the box and maybe think about waters of the tribe versus waters of the U.S. That would uphold that federal trust responsibility. And as I mentioned earlier, this really limits the capability of EPA to do their job And also that trust and partnership has built up, and collaborations are going on across the country with federal agencies like the National Park System. Tribes are coming in, not just with advanced science, but traditional ecological knowledge, and actually propagating plants in Indiana Dunes National Park, sweetgrass, which needs to be propagated or it can't grow. So that's the traditional ecological knowledge that comes to the table when you bring in tribal communities, plus the advanced science. So it's a huge detriment.
So let's build on that.
Okay.
And, how do you think the Supreme Court's Sackett decision will impact the ability of our region to continue producing the results we've seen under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and other programs that have helped us protect and restore it is the world's largest source of fresh water, more than 20%?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so to date, we've spent over $3.6 billion to restore the Great Lakes. And we mentioned, how do we tell whether or not it's working? Well, EPA has tracked those ecological impacts and benefits, and it shows that we're cleaning up the Great Lakes. But we know through science that we're only halfway there. Indiana Dunes National Park, there's a marsh called the Great Marsh, and Cowles Bog is in there, and that bog is what created the theory of ecology. They've restored half of it, 600 acres. They've spent $10 million to do so. They now see great herons, wood ducks. They have not been around in many, many decades. Things are coming alive and coming back. But this, how do we continue those outcomes? This is a complete de-investment to things like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, Everglades, Chesapeake Bay. That data is there of what we've done. And so I would also beg or urge Army Corps and EPA to maybe somehow track these impacts starting today of this decision.
So then let me build on that, and then you can answer this question, but how does the narrowed Clean Water Act, and this is to all the panel, efforts to protect the regional water bodies such as the Great Lakes, the Chesapeake Bay, the Puget Sound, Florida Everglades, or other major multi-state river systems such as the Mississippi River, the Colorado River, the Columbia River, the Delaware River? Donna, you look like you might.
Having been drafted, I'd be happy to start an answer. And I also had another point I thought that might be relevant
Please,
to the
share
protection
both.
of national parks. One of the challenges of multi-state waters is that in Rapanos, and definitely explicitly in Sackett, you have an expectation that states and tribes will fill the gap, whatever it may be, in federal protection. One of the challenges with that is states are not well prepared, nor are tribes, to address waters that are interstate in nature. Under state law and tribal law, they can address waters that are intrastate, but waters in the Mississippi River, 13 states and 3 provinces. How can one state address what's going on? Now, the Mississippi River, I hope, after Sackett, remains jurisdictional, but there are other waters that are important that cross state lines that would be harder to protect. So, and I don't know if it may come back, and perhaps if you'd like to speak.
Any other members of the panel? Keisha?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the question. One of the things that is most amazing to me about the Chesapeake Bay cleanup effort has been the number of partners, whether it's the states, the feds, or NGOs that have been working together, and really the understanding that everyone has to do their part, otherwise this isn't going to be successful. And so I think that's one of the things that is going to be hardest to address. I gave statistics earlier about how much the impacts, from what's happening in Pennsylvania and Delaware would have on Maryland taxpayers. But, Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania have stricter standards, and we already have heard of political pressure being applied in Virginia to backslide to adopt the federal standards now. And so not only do we have to worry about Delaware and West Virginia with them following the federal standards, but now we have to worry about the states that are extremely protective of their wetlands sliding back due to political pressure.
I want to talk a little bit about the Cape Fear River Basin. It's one of 4 river basins in the state of North Carolina that are completely contained in the state. It is the largest river system in the state. It's about 9,000 square miles, and it includes streams that come from 29 of the 100 counties in the state. It dumps into the Atlantic Ocean. It's about 6,500 miles of streams, which is equivalent to about the size of New Jersey. It also has Wilmington in that same Cape Fear River Basin, and we saw with the 500-year floods in 2016 and 2018 that Wilmington is still trying to recover from $17 billion of damage. And if those wetlands are removed and builders have the opportunity, and Sackett really pits builders over homeowners at this point, if those builders are allowed to continue to build in those areas and wetlands are destroyed, we will have serious problems in North Carolina and all of those river basins. And some of our river basins actually go into other states, into South Carolina, or into Virginia. So there are a lot of implications of the decision, generally speaking. And I hope that this body will take some action to try to address this at the federal level.
I'd like to address a couple of the issues on Great Lakes and Chesapeake Bay. We're faced with a situation where the same water body is receiving pollutants or not getting the flood control benefits because the state programs differ so widely. So across the Great Lakes, you have Ohio and Indiana, which to a large degree do not protect the waters that are excluded from Sackett. You have Pennsylvania, which mostly does protect it. You have New York, which protects those waters only if their wetlands are above a certain size. The General Assembly in New York, the legislature, has ratcheted that acreage limit down prospectively, but you've got the same hydrology, but you have a patchwork of inconsistent approaches that we're trying to use while Congress has to wrestle with how do we restore what we once had. And it's not a good situation. My colleague mentions the Chesapeake Bay. Many of those states have robust programs. Delaware has never enacted a state freshwater wetlands law, despite many attempts. Neither the agriculture nor home building industry has been supportive in the past. We'll see what happens going forward. But those waters discharge to the same rivers that run through Maryland and end up in the bay.
Thank you. Representative Dingell and Ms. Davis both mentioned the importance of national parks in the Great Lakes area, and I think we all appreciate our national parks throughout the country. The courts have interpreted the Clean Water Act as being based on Congress's Commerce Clause authority, not, for example, its Property Clause authority. So what that means is waters that are on federal lands, including national parks, are not automatically considered federal waters unless they meet the standard for being a water of the United States. National park waters, waters in the national forests, Bureau of Land Management lands, and so forth, all have to be waters of the United States meeting the standard, and Sackett has shrunk that standard, thus reducing protections for waters that aren't federal waters because they're not WOTUS, even though they are on federal lands. I just thought that that tends to be not widely thought about, and I wanted to point that out because of the importance of national parks in Great Lakes and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Do you want me to ask one more question?
No, I'll give Ms. Stansberry a
I
chance.
think we should go back.
All right, well, thank you again, Madam Chair. I think the question that I'd like to ask, and I'm not sure, I think we have multiple legal experts on this panel, so my question is, help us understand in layman's terms, not in legal terms, in layman's terms, what is the qualitative difference in how this decision will impact our streams and rivers and wetlands versus the Trump rule versus what we were operating under prior to that? Like, what does it actually mean in terms of the exposure of our rivers and streams and wetlands to pollution? And how far does it set us back?
So I'll start, and then all these experts can help me. But if you want to compare where we were and then the Trump administration rule and then where we are now. So where we were before, the Trump rule was a big constriction, a narrowing of where we had been for 45 years. And that was because they said two things: ephemeral waters automatically are out. And number two, your wetland had to have a surface water connection, not a groundwater connection to a jurisdictional water. They also did a third thing, which was pretty stunning, which is they did not retain what we'd had since 1972, that all interstate waters are categorically a water of the U.S. And the reason we did that was because the Clean Water Act was passed because downstream states were being harmed in many ways by upstream states who would not regulate, would not enforce even the rules they did have. So those were the three things they did. Sackett now has taken it a whole nother step, because in addition to obviously ruling out ephemeral, as the Trump rule did, and ruling out wetlands that only have a surface, that only have a subsurface connection, they have now really knocked out the wetlands, because any natural or man-made barrier between a water of the U.S. and this wetland, even when there's a surface water connection, is no longer covered. So that's why I say the whole wetlands, myriad of wetlands outside the levees of the Mississippi River have now lost protection as a water of the U.S. And this is where we're looking at the second largest Gulf of Mexico hypoxia in the world. And we've spent millions and millions of dollars trying to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus to that dead zone. Now, all of that is out of regulation, and it's strictly up to the states if they want to work on that or not.
So I think, based on your description, it's fair to say the headline here is the Sackett decision guts the Clean Water Act even further than Donald Trump tried to during his presidency.
That's correct.
Let me repeat that one more time. The Sackett decision guts the Clean Water Act further than Donald Trump did during his presidency.
Correct.
Folks need to understand what the implications of this bill are, or of this decision, and how far it went. And I think that was a pretty drop-the-mic description, but I want to provide the opportunity for anyone else that has anything else they want to add very quickly, as was stated by the chairwoman. Nobody want to follow? All right, we're going to drop the mic right there, and I turn it back to you.
Mr. Danko.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Another bill that I've got great interest in and that I've been leading is the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act, which obviously will draw additional attention and resources from the federal level. It models itself, Keisha, after Chesapeake and Delaware, and potentially, if it were put into legislative format, into statute, would probably be the most populated watershed in the country. And I think it's long overdue. Basically, it embraces the Hudson, Mohawk, and Raritan rivers and its tributaries. The whole comment made about downstream impact by upstream activity is what it focuses on. So my question to all of you is, how much more relevance does that take? How much more critical is it that we promote legislation like this, approve it, and get it signed into law in the aftermath of this Sackett decision? And my colleague and friend Melanie put a really chilling assessment on it that really makes you cringe. But the impact here is severe. And so what relevance now, what in terms of critical to get this done, is borne by this legislation? Keisha, I thought you might have something to say.
Yeah, I was going to say, I may be a tad bit biased here, working in the Chesapeake Bay region, but I think it's even more important because if we're going to rely on state standards instead of federal standards as we sit here in limbo, then we obviously need to be working closely with all partners at all levels, whether that be the federal government, whether that be the state government, NGO partners. That's what has made the Chesapeake Bay Partnership so successful, is that we have, I hate to say buy-in because that makes it seem like there was something wrong that we had to convince people of, but we do really have the support and commitment from partners at all levels to ensure that we are working in the same direction. So I love the fact that you introduced this legislation and that we're trying to do that in different watersheds.
Well, it's very interesting to watch the passion that our colleague John Sarbanes pours forth on behalf of the Chesapeake, and both being members of Energy and Commerce, it's inspirational to know that there's that kind of leadership and concept that we can invest in.
We are grateful for his leadership.
So I would say that the regulatory programs of the Clean Water Act have always been necessary, but they are not sufficient to restore the health of the nation's waters or regional water bodies so that they can be used by the American people. So voluntary, collaborative, financial support, public-private partnerships, the whole array of things that are possible are still necessary even if we have robust federal regulation.
Great advice, and we'll keep that in mind there, James. Thank you. Yes, Kira.
Yes, I just want to thank you for supporting that type of legislation because it is going to mean that tribes and states do have to step up and need to do things right now. National Parks Conservation Association supports such things like this. And again, as Keisha has mentioned, the collaboration and the coalitions, working with those folks too, along with the state officials and tribes is where we need to be right now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Miranda Miller from my team, who's sitting in that corner over there, has been really championing the effort, and I really appreciate all of her hard work and efforts to get this all done. So need to do that shout out too. So thank you, Miranda.
Thank you, Mr. Tunkel. I have a closing question that is for everybody, that the Sackett decision will be significant and far-reaching. The states and tribes communities, especially those of color, will be required to fill in the gaps, both in cost and in time. However, congressional efforts to fix Sackett will take time. In the meantime, what would you recommend to ensure clean water progress is not lost?
So I'll just start because we at the Environmental Protection Network developed that checklist of actions. It encourages states to do the right thing under each one of the critical actions. And so that's what
Do you not think that some states are reluctant to join?
Absolutely. I mean,
What would you do to be able to convince them or force them to be able to be partners?
I think we need community pressure. That's the only thing we can do at this point.
Well, this is what this is all about. If you will talk to people as if you were talking to your neighbor, this is how important this is. And you are leading the charge, and we are with you, but we need your help.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I was going to say, from our perspective, like as we continue to push forward on the federal law, both with Congress and this new rule that's coming out of the Biden administration, our focus has turned towards the states to ensure that they continue having stricter standards. I mentioned earlier the political backlash that we expect to see and have already heard about in Virginia. In Maryland, we have a different problem where advocates are gearing up and wanting stricter standards than what we have. So I think focusing on the states in the near term as we continue to figure out what the federal folks are doing is probably the best way forward, including using community involvement to make that happen.
In the interim, many states and tribes are working to gather data on the presence and condition and the functions of their wetlands and other waters as part of an effort to have educational outreach to the public. And why are these important? How are they? What condition are they? What's the relationships between, for example, wetlands and safe drinking water? So that they can convince their populations that there's a reason for protecting these waters and that that reason directly benefits them. It will help build sort of resistance to attempts to roll back if public supports and understands why an effective Clean Water Act at the federal level and effective state and tribal protections all come together to protect a resource that we all need to have. But better understanding what you've got and how it's doing and telling people about it is, I think, at the crux of success in many of these areas.
I'm heartened by the fact that the state of Arizona in 2021 did pass a state law to protect Don Wotus waters. We're early enough on in that process, and there's been enough uncertainty given Sackett that it's hard to predict how successful that legislation will be. But I'm heartened by the fact that it was passed. I'm hopeful that it will be something that will help fill the gap. However, I think that the success of that kind of a program depends in part on the connection between water supply and water quality. And as we deal with historic drought conditions in the western United States, I think the federal government's financial support in encouraging water conservation and providing incentives for water conservation actually matters for the protection of both wetlands and ephemeral streams, because the presence of that water alone helps to dilute contamination impacts, helps to reduce salinity. So there are ways in which continued federal support financially for water conservation in the West will help address some of the water pollution issues that you might see in the wake of Sackett.
Well, we in California have done a lot of that, and we're hoping other states will follow suit. Ms. Guerra.
Thank you. I'll mention, I don't know if everybody's aware, but there's 425 units in the national park system. And as Donna mentioned, some of those waters are now vulnerable to upstream pollutants. So I would urge you to keep the national park system in mind as they're mandated not only to protect those lands into perpetuity, to make sure that all Americans can access them. I would also encourage Army Corps and EPA to start tracking those quantitative ecological impacts that they start seeing because of this ruling. I would also say please and thank you for inviting tribes to the table. We have traditional ecological knowledge that we intertwine with sound science, and I thank you for having us at the table, and I would ask that you support any proactive movements by states and tribes that have capacity to move federal water quality, state or tribal standards forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the absence of federal authority over these waters means that the states will need to pick them up even if they're inclined to pick them up, and that will require a benefit from federal dollars if that's possible. And it may be possible that states that are on the fence or considering programs such as Arizona may be more inclined to take that step if there is federal support. The Arizona law that Mr. Larson referred to limited those non-WOTUS water protections to waters that were important for drinking water, recreation, or fishing. I think we could add perhaps flood control, and you could consider possible support for state permitting programs to cover non-WOTUS waters that meet certain federally important goals.
In addition to what Mr. McElfish and the other speakers have said, looking at the situation in rural communities, communities of color and tribal communities, there's a big gap with data. I come from a community where there isn't data. No one's done any studies, so we don't know what those communities need. There is a huge gap. There is also an issue of infrastructure. I'm glad that the Biden administration has invested the kind of money that he has in infrastructure, but so many of these communities don't have basic water systems that they can depend upon. So we need those kinds of continued investments across the United States to help those communities. In addition, Tribal communities are very important. North Carolina has a number of tribes, but only one is federally recognized. So we have tribes that can't benefit from some of the federal regulation that should be available to all of the tribes. It's not that they aren't having the same issues that federally recognized tribes are. So those are some of the things from an environmental justice perspective I think the committee needs to consider as they're looking at the Sackett decision and how to address it.
I'd like to add and encourage everyone here to consider a piece of legislation that's not under your jurisdiction, but you'll all have the opportunity to vote on, the Farm Bill, which is currently up for reauthorization. We work with farmers and ranchers across the country, as well as associations that are promoting sustainable regenerative agriculture, and farmers and ranchers that are taking measures and have taken measures to ensure protection of their wetlands on their land. Also those that are interested in transitioning to a more sustainable model. Currently though, even though there are programs under the Farm Bill and at the USDA that do incentivize wetland protection, they're underfunded compared to many other programs that exist for conventional agriculture at the USDA, as well as there are some conservation compliance provisions under like crop insurance and commodities, but again, these aren't really fully enforced as they should be and could be expanded. So there's a huge opportunity in this Farm Bill and maybe the next Farm Bill or other in-between legislative opportunities to transform the USDA towards more incentivizing of protection of wetlands and conservation, building markets for farmers that are taking these measures, transforming the safety nets so that they are incentivizing and allowing for protection of wetlands, as well as Mrs. White-Williamson was talking about the issue of CAFOs. There's proposals out there to facilitate the transition from CAFOs towards more sustainable livestock operations.
Thank you very much. We have a new member coming, but did you want to add one more question? One more comment?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to add on, well, first of all, I'm really grateful that a number of you highlighted funding, and I know there's folks who are going to watch this, and I want to make everyone aware that over the last 2 years, the previous Congress, we passed two of the largest bills ever in American history to invest in water infrastructure. We passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, both which make significant investments in our arid state infrastructure, in our safe drinking water, in tribal infrastructure, in all of these different areas, and that funding is available. EPA is currently working on getting that money out through grants, through states, through tribal governments, and so if folks are looking for funding, please contact your congressperson. If you don't have a congressperson that's responsive, certainly our committees can act as a good conduit to know how to access that funding. But I did want to add one more thing about a sense of urgency. You know, I heard a lot of comments like, well, it might be a while till Congress acts, and that's absolutely true. But let me just tell you guys, there's only 17 months left of this particular Congress, and we would not have passed the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law if the people of the United States had not stood up and told us to take climate action. And they organized, especially our young people in the streets, and demanded that Congress and the President take action. It is well within our purview to fix this statutorily and for the American people to demand that we have clean water. And we ask you, as our partners in this, we are only as good as politicos as the people that we stand arm in arm and side by side with. We need you to organize, educate, and help the American people understand how significant this decision is and why we need Congress to act now. So thank you.
Madam
Thank
Chair,
you.
if I just could do a quick add-on to what
Quickly?
Representative Stansbury said.
Mr.
Oh, sure. I was just
Go
going
ahead.
to, okay. I'll do it quickly. In addition to what Melanie just said, there's a clawback attempt now to roll back on commitments made in the debt ceiling bill. The ink wasn't even dry, and they were cutting back on the ceiling level for domestic investment. We can't have that. So now an alerted constituency, and we all have a role to play here, is so essential to fight back against these efforts to reduce what already was a haircut. So in addition to what she said, I think that messaging is important. Alert everyone you can to
Thank you, Mr.
to the efforts
Stanko.
here.
Mr. Riggs?
All right, thank you for allowing me to come in a little bit late and still say a few words. Ranking Member Napolitano, former chair, always great to see you and your incredible career fighting for water and water planning and water conservation, all the important issues that you've led on through the T&I committee. Thanks to Ranking Member Larson for putting this together. I did want to come and say just a few words and ask a question of Professor Larson, because he is a professor at the greatest university in America, Arizona State University, that just happens to be in Arizona District 4. Professor Larson, it's great to have you here today to bring an important perspective to the discussion. There is no place in America where water matters more than in Arizona. We are grappling with the impacts of climate change. Mexico is a close second as we grapple with the impacts of climate change and the worst drought in 1,200 years in Arizona. Safeguarding our waters is top of mind for all Arizonans. Across the country, water bodies vary from state to state and region to region. So how waters of the U.S. is defined to account for those differences is critically important. In Arizona, more than 90% of our stream miles are purging our groundwater, carrying floodwaters, and sediment flows to protect property. I'm sure this has already been covered, so I may be asking a question again, but if so, that's still important information. Professor Larson, how do you see the Sackett decision impacting waters throughout the arid Southwest, particularly ephemeral waters?
Well, I agree with my fellow panelist, Donna Downing, that my read of the Sackett opinion, given the amount that it spends referring directly to Justice Scalia's opinion in Rapanos, is that it is effectively just taking Justice Scalia's plurality opinion and making it the new majority opinion. Given my understanding of that opinion, I think virtually all ephemeral waters will be excluded from Clean Water Act jurisdiction. I mean, that is the relatively permanent standard, and by definition, ephemeral waters are not relatively permanent, which means, as you said, over 90, in fact, I think it's over 95% of all stream stretches in the state of Arizona will lie outside the scope of the Federal Clean Water Act. I am hopeful that the 2001 state legislation will help fill some of those gaps, but we are early on enough in that process that it is unclear, I think, how successful we're going to be, especially given the uncertainty of Sackett. So we're going to have to rely on the Aquifer Protection Permitting Program as one way to protect. We'll have to rely on those new designations at the state level, and we'll have to rely on the political will of Arizonans who are worried about the quality of their water and about protecting our water supplies to be able to push forward innovative solutions to protect while we need to, as I say, reform and refine the Clean Water Act.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you for letting me participate just under the wire here. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you, panel. Everybody has been great. I am so pleased to have so many people protecting our waters. It is my intent to start working on federal legislation to restore the clean water protection lost by Sackett. And we'll need your help and help anybody else that has an interest in water, which I would hope would be everybody. We need to start building the same coalition of business, community coalitions, community interest, farmers, citizens, business, that had a hand in enacting the original Clean Water Act. And that is our job and is your job. So if you will help maybe by coalescing all your efforts and making sure that we move ahead, not letting this get any further, and as Melanie has stated and our colleagues tell you, we all are with you, but we need your help. So with that, I will help us do the right thing, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for your testimony, and really appreciate your coming and being with us for almost 2 hours. Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.
Hey, Craig.